There is a particular kind of silence that precedes transformation. Not the silence of emptiness, silence of something enormous moving just beneath the surface, slowly, deliberately, largely unnoticed. Zambia has lived inside that silence for a long time. Most global conversations about Southern Africa orbit around South Africa, its economy, its politics, its turbulence. Maybe Botswana gets a mention for diamonds, maybe Zimbabwe for its complicated history, but Zambia has spent decades being described in the language of limitation. Copper-dependent, aid-reliant, drought-vulnerable, debt-laden. A country sitting on extraordinary mineral wealth, somehow unable to fully translate that wealth into durable, broad-based prosperity. That description is becoming outdated. Somewhere between copper export revenues and quiet diplomatic maneuvering, Zambia started building, not with fanfare, not with global press conferences or dramatic headlines, with blueprints, with cranes, with a kind of methodical, unglamorous patience that serious economic transformation actually requires. Roads, power stations, railways, airports, economic zones, water infrastructure. One project, then another, then another. And here's the part that is genuinely surprising. International infrastructure analysts, the kind of people who assess construction ambition for a living, are now looking at Zambia differently. Not because of what a government press release says, because of what is actually being built on the ground. So the question this documentary is asking isn't simply what these projects are. The question is whether they add up to something real, whether they represent a genuine structural departure from Zambia's historical economic constraints, or whether they are, as African development history has occasionally demonstrated, impressive constructions built on fragile institutional foundations. That is a harder, more honest question. And it is the one worth answering. Let us begin where every honest investigation of an African economy must begin, with the past. When Northern Rhodesia became the independent Republic of Zambia in October 1964, it inherited one of the most copper-rich geological territories on Earth. The Copperbelt, a corridor of mineral-dense rock stretching across the country's northern plateau, had attracted the attention of British mining interests decades before independence. And its value had not diminished with the transfer of political authority. Copper was, at the moment of independence, the economic engine of the new nation. It would remain so for the decades that followed. In many ways, it still is. The first decade under President Kenneth Kaunda was, by some measures, one of relative optimism. Copper revenues funded schools, hospitals, roads, and a social contract between the state and its citizens that felt, for a time, sustainable. Zambia was, in the early 1970s, considered one of the more economically promising countries in sub-Saharan Africa, a distinction it held with some justification. Then the global copper market collapsed. The oil shocks of the mid-1970s cascaded through commodity markets worldwide. Copper prices fell sharply and did not recover quickly enough to prevent serious damage to an economy that had never meaningfully diversified beyond that single export. What followed was a painful stretch of decades. Structural adjustment programs imposed by international creditors, recurring debt crises, a currency that lost value repeatedly, and the social and political instability that sustained economic hardship tends to generate. The privatization of the mining sector in the late 1990s, executed under significant external pressure and in a context of deep fiscal stress, produced outcomes that have been debated ever since. Some analysts credit it with eventually attracting investment and boosting production volumes. Others point to the tax revenues that were foregone, the employment conditions that deteriorated, and the sense among ordinary Zambians that the country's most valuable resources were being managed primarily for the benefit of foreign shareholders. That debate has never been entirely resolved. What is clear is that by the early 2000s, Zambia had accumulated a pattern that economists refer to as the resource curse in its structural form. This is not simply about natural resources being harmful. They are not. It is about the institutional arrangements around resource extraction being unable to distribute generated wealth equitably, diversify the economy beyond primary commodity dependency, or build the kind of physical and human infrastructure that would allow a country to compete in a more complex global economy. Every Zambian government since independence has had to navigate that inheritance. The current administration, like those before it, is attempting something specific: to use a period of improved copper market conditions, driven partly by the global energy transition's voracious appetite for copper and battery and electrical grid applications, to fund and coordinate a wave of infrastructure investment that could begin gradually to diversify the economic base. Whether it succeeds will depend on factors that go well beyond steel and concrete, but the projects themselves are real, and understanding what each one actually does, mechanically, economically, strategically, is where the genuine story begins. Start with water, because that is where economic development actually begins, regardless of what investment brochures prefer to emphasize. The Kafue water supply and sanitation project does not generate headlines. It does not involve geopolitical competition or billion-dollar loan agreements with rival superpowers. But what it addresses is foundational in a way that more glamorous infrastructure projects are not. Zambia's urban population has grown considerably faster than its water infrastructure over the past several decades. In cities like Kabwe, Zambia's fourth-largest urban center, outdated pipeline systems and inadequate sanitation coverage have created chronic inefficiencies that cost households time, cost businesses operating capital, and generate recurring public health vulnerabilities that suppress economic productivity in ways that are real but rarely measured. Clean, reliable water is not a social amenity. It is an economic input. When urban workers are healthier, when manufacturing facilities can operate with predictable water access, when basic urban systems function at the level a growing economy requires, the downstream productivity effects accumulate. The Kafue project, supported by the African Development Bank, is doing the unglamorous foundational work that makes everything built above it more durable. You do not add 10 floors to a building without first reinforcing its base. Now move to connectivity, and here the economic logic becomes immediately more visible. The Lusaka Copperbelt road upgrade addresses what has historically been one of the most economically critical corridors in the country. The road linking Lusaka to the industrial north is, in the most literal sense, the physical spine of Zambia's economy. Copper and other minerals travel this route toward export markets. Goods, workers, capital, and commercial services flow along it between the country's two most economically active regions. Road quality, in Zambia as across much of the continent, has a direct mathematical relationship to transport costs, and transport costs have a direct relationship to the competitiveness of everything produced and moved within an economy. A deteriorated road does not simply inconvenience drivers. It inflates freight costs, increases vehicle maintenance expenditure, discourages logistics investment, and makes the entire economic ecosystem surrounding it structurally less efficient. Upgrading this corridor is not infrastructure spending as an abstraction. It is an intervention in the country's underlying cost structure, one that will compound in its effects over years and decades. The Ndola Lusaka dual carriageway serves a related but distinct strategic function. Ndola is Zambia's third-largest city and one of its most significant industrial centers. The freight volumes moving between it and the capital are enormous, and the previous road configuration created congestion, safety hazards, and logistics inefficiencies that imposed measurable costs on businesses operating along the corridor. The dual carriageway upgrade reduces those costs systematically. It is not exciting, it is effective. Roads, to use a deliberate analogy, are the grammar of economic development. Without adequate connectivity, the most ambitious projects in any other sector struggle to generate the secondary effects. Local supply chains, labor market integration, and market linkages that give infrastructure investment its genuine transformative power. If roads are Zambia's grammar, energy is its oxygen. The electricity situation has been, for years, among the most consequential constraints on Zambia's economic ambitions. The country relies heavily on hydropower, a logical choice given the Zambezi River system and its network of tributaries. But dependence on a single energy source creates a vulnerability that reveals itself predictably and painfully whenever rainfall falls below historical norms. Drought reduces river levels. Reduced river levels reduce hydropower output. Reduced output means load shedding. Rolling power interruptions shut down factories, force businesses to absorb the costs of backup generation, and create the kind of operating environment that persuades investors to locate elsewhere. Climate variability has made that vulnerability increasingly acute. Southern Africa's rainfall patterns have become less predictable, and the infrastructure built for historical precipitation averages is increasingly mismatched to present-day climate realities. The Kafue Gorge Lower power station represents Zambia's most significant addition to its hydropower generation capacity in recent memory. By injecting hundreds of megawatts into the national grid, it substantially increases the baseline electricity available to industrial consumers, most critically to the mining sector, which is among the most energy-intensive industries on Earth. For copper production, reliable power is not a peripheral concern. It is a central determinant of operational continuity and profitability. When the Kafue Gorge Lower station came online, Zambia's energy security took a meaningful step forward. But Zambia has understood something that energy analysts have taken time to fully internalize. The solution to hydropower vulnerability is not simply more hydropower. It is source diversification. This is where the solar expansion program becomes strategically significant, and where Zambia's policy thinking demonstrates a level of forward planning that is not always credited from the outside. Zambia sits in the African Sun Belt. The solar irradiation levels across its territory make photovoltaic generation highly cost-effective under current technology and pricing. The global collapse in solar panel costs over the past decade has transformed what was once economically marginal into one of the most competitive forms of new electricity generation anywhere in the world. Zambia has begun to act on this reality with genuine seriousness. The Bangweulu solar power project added 54 megawatts of renewable capacity to the grid. The Chisamba solar power project, our #1 project and the capstone of this entire energy story, added a full 100 megawatts. Together with other solar developments across the country, these projects are not simply supplementing existing power supply, they are redesigning the architecture of Zambia's energy system. When river levels drop due to drought, solar output continues. The systemic risk that a single-source energy grid carries, the vulnerability that has caused billions of dollars in economic losses through load shedding over past decades, is progressively reduced as solar capacity grows. This is energy portfolio logic applied at the national scale. It is the same principle that any sensible investor applies when constructing a financial portfolio. Diversification to reduce the damage any single adverse event can inflict on the whole system. The Chisamba project deserves particular attention because of what it represents symbolically as much as practically. 100 megawatts of utility-scale solar in a country that has historically depended on rivers and rainfall is not a marginal adjustment. It is a statement of intent, a signal to energy investors, industrial operators, and international partners that Zambia is committed to building an energy base capable of supporting serious economic growth across multiple decades. Signals of this kind matter. International capital reads demonstrated execution far more carefully than policy announcements. The Northern Railway project is where the geopolitics of what Zambia is building becomes fully visible, and where the stakes of success or failure become substantially higher. Zambia is landlocked. This geographic reality carries enormous economic consequences that no policy can entirely eliminate. Every export must travel through a neighboring country to reach a seaport. Every import makes the same journey in reverse. The structural transport cost premium that landlocked economies pay compared to coastal nations is well documented in economic literature. And Zambia has lived with that premium since independence. The strategic response is not to wish away geography. It is to build the most efficient possible connections to multiple ports through multiple corridors, reducing dependency on any single transit route and accumulating leverage in negotiations with both transit countries and port operators. A railway connection northward to Tanzania opens the port of Dar es Salaam as a primary export gateway, one that competes with and provides insurance against dependence on southern routes through Zimbabwe, South Africa, or Mozambique. A connection westward toward the Democratic Republic of Congo opens trade flows with one of Africa's most economically significant nations, a country with its own extraordinary mineral endowment, a large and growing domestic market, and strategic interests that increasingly intersect with Zambia's own. Rail, compared to road transport, dramatically reduces the per-unit cost of moving bulk commodities. For an economy whose primary export is a bulk commodity, copper, that cost differential is not marginal, it is structural. Over the lifetime of a railway, the cumulative savings in transport costs for Zambian exporters and the cumulative reduction in import costs for Zambian consumers amount to a genuine and sustained improvement in the country's economic competitiveness. There is also a geopolitical dimension that deserves direct acknowledgement. Multiple global powers are currently competing, sometimes subtly, sometimes quite explicitly, for influence over African infrastructure corridors. China's infrastructure investments across the continent through the Belt and Road Initiative have been substantial. The United States has responded with its own frameworks. The European Union has developed its Global Gateway program. Gulf sovereign wealth funds are increasingly active. For a country like Zambia, this competition among external actors, while it carries its own risks, creates genuine negotiating leverage. A government that can credibly attract multiple competing investors is in a fundamentally stronger position than one dependent on a single external partner. The Kenneth Kaunda International Airport terminal expansion and the Solwezi International Airport upgrade address different dimensions of the connectivity challenge. Kenneth Kaunda is Zambia's primary international gateway, the front door through which investors, tourists, business delegations, and cargo enter and exit the national economy. Capacity constraints at that gateway impose real costs. Flights redirected, business delegations inconvenienced, cargo logistics complicated. The terminal expansion, executed in 2023, increases throughput significantly and sends the kind of signal that investment communities register clearly. Expansion in anticipation of growth, rather than in reluctant response to it, communicates confidence. Solwezi's upgrade is more specifically strategic. The northwestern province is home to some of Zambia's largest and most productive mining operations. The ability to move executives, engineers, specialized equipment, and high-value cargo efficiently in and out of that region has direct implications for operational timelines and profitability. Improving that access is a productivity multiplier for one of the country's most economically significant geographic nodes. The Lusaka South Multi-Facility Economic Zone expansion rounds out the investment picture by addressing something Zambia has genuinely struggled with historically: building a manufacturing and processing base that sits alongside, rather than entirely beneath, the extractive sector. Economic zones work, when they work, by concentrating infrastructure, utilities, regulatory efficiency, and business services in a single location, reducing the transaction costs that foreign investors face when entering a new market. They are not magical. They require sustained political commitment, competent management, and deliberate linkage to local supply chains and labor markets. The expansion of Lusaka South is a bet that Zambia can make the zone model deliver on its potential, attracting manufacturers, agro-processors, and technology firms who see value in Zambia's location, improving mineral endowment, and growing infrastructure backbone. None of this analysis is credible without a serious engagement with the risks. Balanced assessment is not pessimism. It is the only framework that produces useful conclusions. Zambia defaulted on its external debt in 2020, the first African sovereign default of the COVID-19 era. The restructuring process that followed was lengthy, technically complex, and politically difficult. It involved negotiations with multiple creditor groups, including Chinese state-linked lenders, Western bondholders, and multilateral institutions, and it exposed in detail the degree to which public borrowing had outpaced the economy's capacity to service debt sustainably. The restructuring was eventually completed, but it imposed real costs. reduced fiscal space, constrained public investment capacity, and a period during which Zambia's credit reputation needed careful rebuilding. The debt episode is not simply historical context. It is a living warning about the relationship between infrastructure ambition and fiscal discipline. Infrastructure projects require financing. Financing requires debt service. Debt service requires revenue. Revenue requires economic growth and effective taxation, particularly of the extractive sector. If the projects described in this documentary are financed in ways that reproduce the debt dynamics of the pre-2020 period, then the transformation they represent will be partial at best and potentially counterproductive. Governance risk is equally real. Infrastructure projects in resource-rich economies are, historically, among the most vulnerable to elite capture, the process by which public assets and contracted revenues are diverted toward private and political interests rather than productive economic use. Zambia's institutional environment has improved in certain respects in recent years, but it is not immune to these pressures. The integrity of procurement processes, the quality of contract terms with foreign investors, and the effectiveness of revenue collection from mining operations. These institutional questions will determine whether the infrastructure investments described here generate broad-based prosperity or simply shift who captures resource rents. Currency vulnerability adds another layer of complexity. The Zambian kwacha has experienced significant depreciation pressures across multiple periods, driven by copper price volatility, import dependence, and the dollar-denominated nature of much external debt. Exchange rate instability creates uncertainty for investors, inflates the kwacha cost of servicing foreign currency loans, and reduces the real purchasing power of households at precisely the moments, commodity downturns, when that purchasing power is already under pressure. Youth unemployment is the human dimension of all of this. Zambia has one of the youngest populations on the continent. Demographically, this is an enormous potential asset if the economy can generate productive employment at sufficient scale. But it is simultaneously a source of social and political pressure if infrastructure investment does not translate into accessible, meaningful work. Roads built by foreign contractors using imported equipment generate far less local employment than roads built by domestic firms using locally sourced materials. Economic zones that import their entire workforce and supply chain contribute far less to the local economy than zones genuinely integrated with domestic producers. These distinctions are not technical footnotes. They are the difference between infrastructure that transforms and infrastructure that merely impresses. There is a reason that the conversation about Zambia's infrastructure program is not confined to Lusaka. Copper is central to the global energy transition in a way that no policy can substitute around. Electric vehicle batteries require copper. Solar panel installations require copper. Wind turbine generators require copper. The electrical grid upgrades necessary to accommodate dramatically higher levels of renewable energy generation require enormous volumes of copper. Global copper demand projections across virtually every analytical framework show substantial growth over the coming decades, and the world's copper supply is geographically concentrated in a relatively small number of countries. Zambia is one of them. The Democratic Republic of Congo, its neighbor to the north, is another. This is not an abstraction. It is why American strategic policy frameworks have begun paying closer attention to Southern and Central Africa in recent years. It is why European supply chain diversification discussions increasingly include Zambia. It is why Chinese investment in Zambian mining and infrastructure, which has been significant for over 2 decades, continues under various configurations despite the complexity of Zambia's debt restructuring experience. The energy transition has transformed copper from an industrial commodity into a strategic mineral, the kind of resource that major powers actively seek to secure supply chain access to, not simply purchase on spot markets. This shifts Zambia's negotiating position in ways that are genuinely new. A country that holds significant reserves of a resource that the world's largest economies urgently need has leverage it did not previously possess. Whether Zambia's institutional capacity is sufficient to convert that leverage into favorable terms, rather than simply attracting extraction on terms set primarily by external parties, is one of the most important open questions in its political economy. The regional dimension matters as well. Southern Africa's economic integration has proceeded unevenly for decades, with the Southern African Development Community providing a framework that has generated more aspiration than actual integration in many areas. Zambia's infrastructure investments, particularly the rail connections, the road upgrades, and the airport expansions, position the country as a potential logistics hub within a region that genuinely needs better physical connectivity. If SADC integration deepens, a well-connected Zambia benefits disproportionately. If it stagnates, Zambia's investments still pay dividends domestically, but the multiplier effect of regional trade is foregone. There are three plausible trajectories for what Zambia's infrastructure program actually produces over the next decade and beyond. They are worth thinking through with some specificity, because the difference between them is not random. It is determined by specific institutional and political choices that Zambia's government and society will make in the coming years. In this trajectory, the infrastructure investments described here form the foundation of a genuine diversification of the Zambian economy. The energy investments provide the stable, affordable electricity that manufacturing requires. The transport investments reduce logistics costs sufficiently to make Zambian producers competitive in regional markets. The economic zones attract manufacturers who genuinely integrate with local supply chains, generating employment and technology transfer at meaningful scale. The railway connections reduce Zambia's landlocked disadvantage and establish the country as a logistics node for Southern African trade. Copper revenues, managed with improved fiscal discipline, fund public services and create the human capital base, educated, healthy workers that a more complex economy requires. Enough foreign investors arrive not simply to extract minerals, but to participate in a growing domestic and regional market. In 20 years, a visitor to Zambia encounters an economy that looks meaningfully different from the copper monoculture of the past. This scenario is possible. It is not guaranteed. In this trajectory, the infrastructure projects are completed but fail to generate the secondary economic effects that would make them transformative. The energy investments stabilize supply without enabling the manufacturing expansion they were intended to support. The roads improve logistics for existing industries without attracting new ones. The economic zones attract investment on terms that benefit foreign operators more than domestic workers or suppliers. Copper remains dominant. Debt from infrastructure financing creates recurring fiscal pressure. Institutional weaknesses, governance gaps, elite capture, regulatory inconsistency prevent the economy from ascending the value chain. The country is somewhat more comfortable than it was, somewhat better connected, somewhat more energy secure. But the fundamental structural limitations persist. This is not catastrophe, but it is a missed opportunity of historic proportions. In this trajectory, a combination of external shocks and internal governance failures derails the trajectory. A sharp and sustained copper price decline undermines revenue projections and forces spending cuts that delay or abandon projects mid-implementation. Debt service pressures from infrastructure financing crowd out essential public expenditure, generating social discontent. Political competition produces policy reversals or creates environments hostile to private investment. Climate shocks, drought-reducing hydropower, or extreme weather-damaging road infrastructure impose costs that overwhelm fiscal capacity. The ambitious infrastructure program becomes, in the popular memory, another chapter in a long history of development promises that under-delivered. This scenario is not inevitable, but history provides enough examples to take it seriously. The variable that separates these three futures is not external, it is internal. The quality of Zambian governance, the effectiveness of institutions, the integrity of the political process, and the degree to which ordinary Zambians have genuine agency over how national resources are managed. These are the determinants that no infrastructure project, however well engineered, can substitute for. We opened with a silence. The silence of something enormous moving beneath the surface, unnoticed by most of the world, unaccompanied by dramatic announcements. What Zambia is building is real. The water systems, the roads, the solar installations, the hydropower capacity, the railway corridors, the airports, the economic zones. These are not projections or promises. They are physical objects in the world, requiring engineering, labor, capital, and sustained political will to bring into existence. That matters. In a continent where ambitious development plans have a long history of existing primarily on paper, the fact of actual construction is itself significant. But the silence that preceded this transformation is now ending. The world is beginning to pay attention, not because of a press tour or a diplomatic offensive, but because the logic of the global energy transition has placed Zambia's copper reserves, and by extension Zambia's political and economic trajectory, squarely inside the strategic calculations of the world's major powers. That attention brings opportunity. It also brings pressure and risk and the particular temptations that come with suddenly being valuable to external parties whose interests do not always align with the long-term well-being of Zambian citizens. The 10 projects described in this documentary represent one of the most serious infrastructure investment waves Zambia has ever undertaken. Whether they produce a decade of genuine economic transformation or simply a decade of impressive construction depends on choices that are still being made. In government ministries, in mining contract negotiations, in the institutions that manage public funds, and in the political culture that either holds power accountable or allows it to operate without scrutiny. What is not in question is that Zambia is building, methodically, strategically, with a coherence of purpose that was not always present in the country's development planning. The world wasn't paying attention, it is beginning to. And what it finds when it looks closely is a country that spent years laying foundations while the cameras were pointed elsewhere. Whether those foundations hold, whether the structure built upon them is one that works for the people who live inside it, is the question that will define the next chapter of this story. That chapter is still being written. If this breakdown changed how you see Africa's economic transformation, you need to see what's coming next. Subscribe now, because the next country quietly rewriting global expectations is already in motion, and you'll want to understand it before everyone else does. Comment below. Which of these 10 projects do you think will have the biggest long-term impact on Zambia? The railway, the solar farms, the economic zone,